You can't just walk away from this. We need your help.
The massive, ancient stable was a cathedral of wood and shadows, the air heavy with the honest, earthy scent of hay, sun-baked earth, and the faint, sweet trace of molasses feed. Dusty, sun-baked Jake, a man whose deep wrinkles told stories of 1,000 high-noon shadows, finished hosing down his prize mare, Honeycomb. He was a cowboy cut from old, worn denim, reliable, quiet, and rough around the edges, his life a steady, unchanging prairie. For decades, his existence had been defined by duty, solitude, and the vast, silent acceptance of the land itself. He hadn't realized how deeply lonely he was until the silence began to feel like a cage. He had just finished hosing down Honeycomb at the wash rack, the scent of wet metal and damp hair clinging to him. His faded denim shirt, soaked through from the effort, lay discarded on a nearby hay bale, leaving his torso exposed. Jake's body was not the smooth, idealized form of youth. It was a testament to his life, a road map of rope scars, sun-darkened skin that looked like worn leather, and powerful, dense muscle built from years of wrestling cattle and hauling feed. Every chord in sin was earned. The sudden sight of him, half naked and glistening from the residual water, was raw, visceral, and unexpected. Jake was toweling the sweat and dust from his neck and face. For a fleeting moment, as the sunlight angled through the loft window, catching the dust motes, he let his mind drift into a deep, familiar longing. He imagined a different kind of life, one unburdened by the ranch's severe traditions, one where he could share this quiet heat and solitude with someone, anyone, who saw him, not just the cowboy facade. He pictured a tender, younger face, the face he saw sometimes across the mess hall, someone soft, yet strong enough to weather the prairie winds. A fool's dream, he thought, letting the fantasy settle into a familiar ache, a sorrow as deep as the canyons he rode. Jake was still lost in that imagined world. The towel paused mid-swipe when Leo walked in. Jake froze, the rough terry cloth dropping slightly. The reality of afternoon Leo, the younger man, the object of his secret longing, stood right there, materializing in the exact space Jake's mind had just conjured. His eyes, usually clouded with the quiet exhaustion of lifelong labor, focused on the younger man with a flicker of startled, consuming interest he hadn't felt in decades. The dream had walked into the stable, demanding his immediate, unwavering attention. Leo walked in. He stopped dead, his own breath catching as he took in the sight of the cowboy. The sheer physical reality of Jake, the thick forearms, the defined lines of his chest and shoulders moving with the simple act of breathing, and the undeniable power etched into his frame was shocking in its intensity. Leo wasn't just attracted, he was seeing history written on a man's body. For Leo, it was the first time he truly understood the physical cost and beauty of the life Jake lived. Leo was headed for the spigot by the feed room, but for a long moment he was held captive by the sheer, unvarnished strength before him. His city-refined senses reeled slightly, replaced by a deep, visceral fascination that felt dangerous and exciting. "Afternoon, Jake," Leo said, his voice bright, holding a worn bucket. He glanced at Jake, a brief smile lighting up his face before he managed to pull his eyes away and turn to fill his container. "Afternoon, Leo," Jake replied, his voice a low rumble that felt suddenly shaky and deep. In that brief, sun-dappled moment of shared solitude in the stables, Jake felt an undeniable pull, a profound attraction that cut through decades of stoic solitude and fear. The simple act of watching Leo fill the bucket became a pivot point. Jake knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to know this man. They shared the workspace, and from that day, Jake began his quiet, steady pursuit. It was never aggressive, just present. He found reasons to linger, a piece of tack to oil, a stall to check, waiting patiently by the half-open door, always timing it just as Leo was finishing up his bookkeeping or starting a chore. They shared moments, small pockets of quiet understanding that grew rapidly. They talked horses, the perpetually dry weather, and the ridiculous price of grain, the mundane forming the indispensable foundation of something deeper. Leo would lean against a post, listening to Jake's rambling advice on horse temperament, and Jake would find himself fascinated by Leo's analytical mind, which could categorize hay purchases with the same intensity he might approach a philosophy textbook.
The transition from acquaintance to secret lovers began subtly. One evening, after the ranch hands had retired, Jake found Leo sitting alone on a stack of feed bags, charting the week's supply on a clipboard. The air was cool now, settled, the barn cloaked in a velvet silence only broken by the soft shuffling of hoofs. Jake approached him, his shadow falling across Leo's page. Leo looked up, the weariness of the day etched around his eyes. "Long day?" Jake murmured, lowering himself carefully beside him. "Every day," Leo sighed, resting his head back against the hay bales. "But good." He didn't pull away when Jake raised a hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hay from his hair. The contact was electric, slow and certain. Jake waited, letting the moment stretch, his heart hammering against his ribs, the only sound in the vast barn. When Leo turned his head slightly, a quiet invitation in his eyes, Jake leaned in, his rough, sun-chapped lips finding Leo's. A first kiss that was tentative, then sure, sealing the unspoken contract between them. It was quiet, deep, tasting of dust and sweet feed, and felt like coming home. From that night, their shared time in the stable became their initial refuge, a place for whispered words, stolen affection, and the fierce protective energy of a new secret. They established a quiet ritual. After the evening meal and the last check of the horses, they would meet near the decommissioned windmill pump house, a dark, creaking shadow about 50 yards past the bunkhouse lights. There, in the deep silence of the prairie night, Jake would pull a small flask of cheap whiskey from his pocket, and they would share a sip. The whiskey was harsh, but the shared moment was liquid gold. One night, Leo rested his hand on Jake's massive forearm, tracing the raised line of an old branding scar. "Does it hurt?" he whispered. Jake shook his head. "Not anymore. It's just part of the story." In turn, Leo spoke about his life in the city, the stifling pressure to be someone he wasn't, the relief he found in the endless, honest work of the ranch, and in Jake's steady, accepting eyes. The intimacy wasn't just physical. It was the slow, deliberate sharing of their souls, vulnerabilities traded like precious currency. Leo confessed the name of his favorite novel. Jake admitted he was afraid of retirement. These were the things that truly bound them. Their love grew in shared labor and visual intimacy. One fiercely hot afternoon, they were tasked with mending a section of perimeter fence far out on the west ridge. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the air until it shimmered. After 2 hours of swinging a sledgehammer, Jake, still favoring the exposed work look from the initial encounter, paused, catching his breath, letting Leo see the effort and muscle memory work beneath his tanned, scarred skin. The sight was intoxicating to Leo. Jake's age and strength laid bare under the Texas sky. "Need a break, old man?" Leo teased, handing him a warm canteen, his eyes lingering for a second too long. Jake smirked, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Got a lifetime arrest waiting, kid. Just need to finish this. When they finally finished, exhausted and covered in sweat, they collapsed together under the meager shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing a bottle of cool water and the profound, wordless intimacy of shared, hard-won accomplishment. A week later, Jake nicked his arm badly on a barbed wire fence while cutting through brush. Leo found him back at the stables, silently trying to clean the jagged wound with a rough piece of cloth. Without a word, Leo took charge, retrieving his small, immaculate first aid kit from his cabin. He cleaned, sterilized, and bandaged the wound with a careful, tender efficiency that melted Jake's gruff exterior. As Leo worked, his breath soft on Jake's skin. Jake watched him, realizing that Leo's strength wasn't muscle, but a profound, quiet capacity for care. When Leo finished, he didn't pull away. He pressed a soft kiss directly on the freshly covered bandage. This small act of devotion cemented their connection more than any shared secret. The constant threat of discovery lent their intimacy a thrilling, dangerous edge. One late Tuesday evening, they were in the tack room, a space barely large enough for two, sharing a rare, long kiss shielded by hanging saddles. Suddenly, the floorboards groaned outside. Jake froze, pushing Leo away with a speed that felt like a painful rejection. "Someone's coming," he mouthed, his eyes wide. It was Foreman Earl, checking the locks. They scrambled, Leo pretending to be searching for a lost ledger page, Jake frantically adjusting a bridle. Earl walked past the half-open door, his gaze suspicious, lingering just long enough to make their skin crawl. The air was thin, silent except for the frantic hammering of two hearts. "Everything all right in here, Jake?" Earl drawled, his voice slow and heavy. "Just helping Leo find a misplaced report," Jake lied smoothly, his voice unwavering despite the panic twisting in his gut. He knew his life, and more importantly, Leo's future, depended on that lie. Earl nodded slowly and moved on. The moment he was gone, Leo leaned his head against Jake's chest, shaking. "That was too close. My heart is pounding." Jake held him fiercely, the fear morphing instantly into a possessive love. I know. We gotta be smarter." The incident shook Jake to his core. The fear wasn't for himself. It was the horrifying possibility of Leo being hurt, judged, or forced to leave because of him. He carried the weight of protecting Leo's innocence in this harsh world, and the burden was almost unbearable. This fear led to their inevitable conflict. They were near the mess hall, and Leo, fueled by happiness and a desire for some small public recognition of their bond, tried to playfully touch Jake's arm. Jake flinched almost imperceptibly, his eyes darting to Foreman Earl, who was passing by, and he pulled away as if burned. Later that night, in the privacy of Jake's cramped, dusty cabin, Leo confronted him, his voice tight with hurt and rejection. "Why do you hide us, Jake? Are you ashamed?" Jake sat on the edge of the cot, scrubbing a weary hand across his face. The agony was plain. "Never of you, Leo, never. It's the life I lived. They don't understand, not out here, not really. It's fear, kid, not shame. Fear of losing what we found, fear of losing you to their judgment. They'd chew you up." For a horrifying second, Jake almost rose and walked out the door, believing that his departure might be the only way to truly save Leo. But he couldn't. Leo saw the truth in his eyes, the deep-seated anxiety of a man who'd spent a lifetime protecting his heart, a quiet terror that threatened to extinguish their fragile joy. "I love you," Jake stated, the rare and profound declaration cutting through the tension, smoothing over every rough edge. Leo felt his own walls crumble and kissed him, fiercely this time, an intimate kiss that spoke volumes about acceptance and shared struggle against an unforgiving world.
Their commitment was tested again at the company barbecue, when one of the hands made a casual, coarse joke about Leo's city ways and his perceived softness. Leo froze, but before he could react, Jake, without raising his voice, met the ranch hand's eyes with a look of such cold, absolute authority that the man quickly changed the subject and looked away. It was a subtle, public defense, a message sent without a single spoken word, and it meant everything to Leo. He knew then that Jake's fear of the ranch community was real, but his devotion was stronger. To ease the tension and find a space truly their own, they planned a trip, a necessary supply run to the nearest town, 80 miles away. It felt like an escape, a test run of their future freedom. They spent the night in a cheap motel, their first time away from the ranch, a tiny island of privacy in the middle of a world that didn't know them. The freedom was intoxicating. They shed their work clothes, the dust and the secrecy falling away with the denim. They talked for hours, shedding the roles of ranch hand and bookkeeper, revealing their deepest fears and aspirations. Leo lay with his head resting on Jake's chest, listening to the powerful rhythm of the heart he now knew belonged to him. The true intimacy came when Jake, for the first time, didn't flinch when Leo reached for him under the harsh motel room light. They didn't have to whisper. They could simply be. The knowledge that for one night they were just Jake and Leo, alone and uncensored, was a powerful, intoxicating liberation that solidified their commitment far more than any conversation could. Jake admitted that holding Leo felt like the first truly safe thing he'd done in 30 years, a confession that broke Leo's heart and cemented his future. They spent many evenings walking through the quiet spaces of the ranch. Sometimes they'd simply stroll through the stables after dark, the only light the thin sliver of moon filtering through the high vents. It was in these dark, hallowed places that their intimacy deepened. A hand reaching for a flashlight brushing against a bare forearm, a shared conspiratorial laugh when they had to duck to avoid Foreman Earl. It was a secret language built on shared silence and physical closeness, often ending with a lingering, protective embrace behind the tack room door. One Friday night, they drove Jake's old pickup out into the prairie, away from the ranch lights and the last vestiges of civilization. They lay side by side on the dusty hood, the milky ribbon of the galaxy stretching above them, the silence vast and profound. "Before you, Jake," Leo confessed quietly, "I felt like I was always waiting for my life to start, like I was just a visitor passing through." Jake turned his head, his rough cheek resting against the cool metal of the truck. "You ain't a visitor here, Leo. You're home. You're my home." He reached across the hood and pulled Leo's hand to his chest, placing it over the heavy, reliable beat of his heart. It was a solemn, unspoken confession of love, a promise as vast and timeless as the stars above them. Leo rested his head on Jake's shoulder, and they stayed like that, their future stretching out bright and unbroken in the darkness, seemingly immune to time.
The following Saturday evening, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun bleed orange and purple over the plains. Jake had spent the whole day feeling a strange, dull ache creeping down his left arm, and a profound weariness deeper than usual. But he'd pushed it away, focusing only on Leo. It was a perfect, still moment, the kind that feels like forever. Jake had just finished telling a rambling, half-forgotten story about a cattle drive decades ago, a story about freedom and the open road he'd never taken. Leo laughed, resting his head back against the wall, utterly relaxed. "You're a good storyteller, Jake." "Just lived a long time, son," Jake murmured, his gaze fixed on the last sliver of light. He felt a profound sense of peace, a completeness born of Leo's presence. He tightened his grip on Leo's hand, an acknowledgement, a thank you, and a quiet statement of their future which he felt certain stretched before them now. "I like the life you've lived, Leo," Leo whispered. Jake started to respond, a lifetime of pent-up feelings about to spill out in a sudden rush of love and contentment. But as he drew a breath, a sharp, violent pain, not a squeeze, but a crushing white-hot vice seized his chest, radiating instantly into his jaw and down his left arm.
Every nerve ending screamed. He gasped, the air failing to fill his lungs, the colors of the sunset exploding into static behind his eyes. He felt a cold, distant certainty. This was the end of the line, the price of the life he'd hidden. His hand tightened instinctively on Leo's, with a strength born of sheer, final desperation, his knuckles bone-white. The sound that escaped him was not a word, but a ragged, terrifying choke. He slumped forward, his body rigid, then instantly slack. Leo screamed Jake's name, the sound tearing from his throat. The world dissolved into noise and panic. He caught Jake's dead weight, lowering him to the dusty wooden floor. His analytical mind, honed by years of quick thinking, took over despite the panic. He felt for a pulse, faint, erratic, then terrifyingly weak. He saw the pure terror in Jake's eyes before they glazed over, a look that said, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving you." "Help! Someone! Get help! It's Jake!" Leo was already on his knees, his hands cupping Jake's pale, sweat-slicked face. He started shouting, his city voice thin but piercing in the evening air. Ranch hands spilled out onto the porch, followed by Foreman Earl, whose look of annoyance instantly turned to shock and grim realization. "He's having a heart attack. Call 911, now!" Leo barked, his voice suddenly commanding, cutting through the rancher's stunned silence. While someone fumbled for a phone, Leo cradled Jake's head, watching the man who was his entire world fade before his eyes. Leo started compressions, driven by sheer willpower and a furious refusal to let this silence claim Jake.
The next 12 hours were a blur of dust, flashing lights, and sterile hospital white. Leo rode in the ambulance, refusing to leave Jake's side. He didn't care who saw them, who questioned him. He sat in the waiting room, still covered in ranch dust, refusing even the hospital coffee, until his clothes smelled faintly of fear and antiseptic. When the doctor finally emerged, hours later, Leo stood up so fast his chair clattered back. "He's stabilized," the doctor said, weary but relieved. "Severe myocardial infarction. You acted fast, Leo. Fast enough. You saved his life." Leo collapsed back onto the plastic chair, the relief so physical it felt like a heavy, crushing wave lifting from his own chest, leaving him weak and shaking. It was 3 agonizing days before Leo was allowed to see Jake, who looked diminished but alive, hooked up to a maze of wires and monitors. When Jake finally woke, his eyes fluttered open and found Leo immediately. He couldn't speak, but his lips moved in a silent, weak attempt at a word. Leo leaned close, tears stinging his eyes. "Shh, it's okay. You're safe. You're right here." Jake's hand, still weak, managed to lift and touch Leo's cheek, seeking connection. It was a shaky, tender gesture, more eloquent than any speech. A week later, Jake was sitting up, facing reality and his own mortality. Leo was by his side when the ranch owner, Mr. Harrison, came in to discuss Jake's recovery and future on the ranch. Earl was waiting outside, surprisingly subdued. The ranch owner offered Jake light work, but added, with a sympathetic yet firm glance toward Leo, "You'll need to decide what's next, Jake. This life is hard. You might need a place where things are simpler." That night, alone with Leo, Jake looked at him, his face etched with a sudden, fierce clarity that swept away decades of denial. "That fear I told you about, of losing you, of them finding out, it was nothing compared to thinking I lost this." He tapped his chest. "When I grabbed your hand, Leo, that was the only thing holding me to this world, the only thing I wanted to keep." "What are you saying?" Leo whispered, his hand instinctively gripping Jake's. "We aren't hiding anymore," Jake said, his voice stronger than it had been since the attack, laced with a new, uncompromising resolve. "And we aren't staying here. This life almost killed me, Leo. Not the labor, the secrecy. I'm selling my share of the cattle. We're getting a small place somewhere near town, somewhere we can just be, without looking over our shoulders, without hiding in the damn tack room." Leo smiled, a tear tracing a path through the dust he hadn't washed off his cheek for days. It was the end of a lifetime of work, the end of the ranch they knew, but the start of a life together, public and real, a life where Jake's heart could finally beat freely. "I like the sound of that life, Jake," Leo affirmed, and he leaned down and kissed his cowboy, not in the shadows of a tack room, but in the bright, unforgiving light of a new day. They had lost the sunset, but they had won the dawn.